didn't reconnect with my Aboriginal family and reached till I was 22. My mother suffered the same when she was 10 years old. She was removed and didn't reconnect with her family until she was 16. Child protection in Victoria. So it's now into our third generation of my family it's affecting. So it's intergenerational trauma. So it's my children, back to me, and back to my mother. We're all going through the system now. Well, she didn't grow up with her family after 10, and they were a very traditional Aboriginal family living on the riverbanks at Swan Hill in a big tin shed that my great-grandfather built for them. So they moved from South Australia around 1940 after my non-Aboriginal grandfather went to war. He went and signed up in Adelaide, and then welfare were going to take my uncles and aunties because they were fair. So the family left Bordertown, South Australia, and moved to Swan Hill in Victoria. And my mother was taken after my grandfather died 3 years after returning from the... Well, I can't talk out of school about my mother, but, over the years she battled with alcohol a lot and broken relationships. And I was the second child that she had removed from her. My big sister was taken when she was 6 days old from the Mildura Hospital. And we've never managed to make contact with her. We've tried through link up over the years, but she didn't want to have anything to do with us, didn't know anything about us, and it was a big shock to her. So, it's made a very large impact on... Well, it breaks down the transition of our traditional culture to the next generation. I see it as assimilation policy still in action today, that we had in the 50s and early 60s in this country, and it's had a huge impact on virtually hundreds of thousands of us Aboriginal people. And it's not a part of government policy today, but it's insidious and it still exists through the way that the various child protection departments around the country treat Aboriginal families. To have 2,500 Aboriginal children in Victoria alone in out-of-home care on any given night of the year, it raises serious questions about what's going on here, and are we seeing the flow-on effects of those earlier stolen generations now? Well, they tried to fix some of the problems because there's legislative requirements for the departments to deal with Aboriginal children in a slightly different way to non-Aboriginal children. But they've got what we call the Access program in Victoria. We used to have one overarching program run under VACA, the Victorian Aboriginal and Childcare Agency, that did very well. It was run by grassroots Aboriginal people, and they went into bat for us when they came and took our kids away. I know instances of, one for certain, where one of our kids was found in Western Australia, and one of the people that used to work for VACA, he actually got on a plane and went to Western Australia and brought that young fella home. He was a Swan Hill boy, that boy. Now that the program has been farmed out to the local Aboriginal organisations, it doesn't have the same effect. Because sadly, a lot of the people that have been affected by that assimilation policy over the years and the breakdown in culture run those organisations now, and they've lost touch with the grassroots Aboriginal people. Well, you got to go back to the late 1800s and the 1900s for us, Tony, when it was actually outlawed for our people to speak language and transmit culture from generation to generation. But my family all used to speak language. When Mum was a baby, they were all speaking language. No, they tried to put bits of it back together these days, little snippets from settlers' diaries and stuff like that. But there's actually no fluent speakers, and nobody actually thought to, record it when there still were. Well, our language, it's very descriptive. I've heard it described as a very romantic sort of language. So, language is part of identity. And, we've grown those languages in the thousands and thousands of generations that we've been here. And to have them taken away from us in a matter of 233 years, you know, and have our entire language replaced with a foreign one. You know, a lot of our links to our culture comes through that language. And that's, you know, part of the breakdown. We live in modern Australia, you know, I accept that, and we've got to speak English to be able to communicate, because I don't expect every Australian to learn my people's language. You know, some people do that work a lot with Aboriginal people out in the bush country, you know, where people still fluently speak their languages. Like, and you got to realise that there was over 250 separate languages spoken in this country, broken down into roughly about 1,500 different dialects. Yeah, so, you know, some of the people out in the bush camps now can speak 6, 7 or 8 languages, and English is the last one on the list. You know, with the removal of me, like, I was given to my father's mother and his stepfather, and they raised me from 3 months until I was, you know, in my late teens. And I didn't find out that I was Aboriginal myself till I was 18. So it was, you know, culture shock to me when I came home to meet my family when I was 22. I grew up in a small country town in central Queensland, Mount Morgan, a very racist town. There was a big race divide in there. There was a large Aboriginal population, and I had some sort of an affinity with the Aboriginal people of the town. But I was shunned by a lot of my school friends' families. People I went to school with, I wasn't allowed in their homes because I hung around with the blackfellas. You know, and so I knew about blackfellas a bit, but I didn't. It was still a culture shock to me to find out that I was Aboriginal myself. My father came home and found me. Well, he knew where we were all the time, but my father came and met me when I was just before I turned 18, and he told me that Mum was Aboriginal. Well, it sort of answered a lot of questions for me. They've been raised. I was, you know, wondered why I was different to the rest of my family, and some of my family didn't treat me very well, and it sort of made sense of that because they're from a very large landholding family in Queensland. So, you know, some of my non-Aboriginal family were probably involved in the depopulation of Aboriginal people in Queensland at one time. Well, my mum, she sort of, you know, wasn't real close to the family anymore after she'd been put in a home. She was running away all the time when she was in her teenage years, and they gave up on her when she was 16, and she went onto the streets of Fitzroy. And my father, he ran away from home when he was 12 years old because he was from a deserted family. My actual grandfather ran away and left my grandmother with a farm and 3 children. In those days, being a deserted wife was as bad as being a blackfellow. So he ran away with Jimmy Sharman's boxing tent when he was 12 years old. Grew up in the tent with young Jimmy, and a lot of my uncles boxed, and that's how my father met my uncles, and then that's how he met my mother eventually. And then he took her up to Sydney, and he was up there, and he got put in jail, and Mum couldn't cope. You know, she had no supports around her, no family support there and that, and because of the breakdown with her being removed, you know, she was too ashamed to go home to the family and that. So she was put in a mental hospital, Roseville Mental Hospital, and that's where they took me away from her. Never saw her again until I was 22. Well, yeah, like life-changing. Probably the only way I could describe it, life-changing. I caught a train up from Melbourne. So I made contact with her through people in Fitzroy, and one of the gentlemen that used to run Aboriginal housing in Fitzroy, when he realised who I was, he picked up the phone and he dialed my mother. I didn't realise he was ringing my mother at that stage because they used to knock around Fitzroy together. And he said, I've got someone here that needs to talk to you. And he handed the phone over to me and he said, here, talk to your mother. And yeah, we were both a bit lost for words for a while. And I got on the train, and 10:30 that night I met my mother and my sisters and a couple of cousins and aunties and uncles for the first time. Oh, it was scary actually, because, you know, I didn't know whether they'd want me or not. I didn't know anything about why I wasn't with them, you know, growing up and that. Never been told the circumstances or anything. So, you know, I thought maybe they wouldn't want me there and I wouldn't be able to fit in, but it also felt like I actually fitted in somewhere for the first time in my life. I belonged somewhere. Well, it was a slow process, I suppose, really, when I really did. See, we didn't have any help from anybody with this because we didn't go through anything like link up with that. I actually found Mum through talking to people in the park in St Kilda. Worked out who we are and that. But when I came home, I met the elder of ours a week later, and he introduced me to our culture and tradition, and helped me understand who I was as an Aboriginal man. And you know, I don't know if I'd be alive if I hadn't met him. I spent many hours around the fire, out on the riverbank with him and doing cultural work. He had me out reburying my ancestors a young time, and I've been doing that for 31 years now. No, I felt lost all my life. I felt like I didn't fit in anywhere. It was my grandmother and my step-grandfather. Grandfather to me, you know, they were wonderful people, you know, beautiful, loving people. I grew up with a, you know, I was one of the lucky ones. I had people that looked after me that actually loved me and cared for me, but they didn't supply the cultural needs that I had. My grandmother wouldn't talk about it, but my auntie sort of hinted that when I was about 10 that my mother had died, that she wasn't alive anymore. When my father turned up when I was 17, turning 18, and you know, I asked him about, you know, what Mum was like and that, and you know, and I said, you know, I wish she was still around. He went, what? Yes, she is. I said, what? No, I was told that she was dead. He's gone, no, we only divorced a couple of years ago. Well, they hadn't been in contact since I was 3 months old, but they'd stayed married for years and years. They just didn't go about getting a divorce. So yeah, it was a bit of a shock when I found out that she was still alive. You know, I felt like I had another birthday, that I was born again. And I've lived 2 different lives, you know, up until I was 18, and from then on until now, I've lived a very, very different life to what I did as a young person. There's been some hard bits of it, like, you know, being a fair-skinned Aboriginal and not growing up with the mob, so I've got different ways to a lot of the mob. You know, and there's a bit of reverse racism in our people sometimes towards fair-skinned people. So, you know, some of my own people have made it hard for me to fit in, but the majority have been, you know, welcoming and good to have another one home. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was lucky having a good, loving grandmother, and she taught me a lot of good things about life and about people and that. But it was a very Eurocentric view. And while she held the old traditional people, the full bloods as she called them, in high regard, but she didn't really like newer generations with a lot of mixed blood. She said they were trouble, and you know, they didn't know how to behave and all that sort of stuff. So she developed a bit of a racist mindset, and I'm glad that in the last few years of her life, when, you know, after I'd come home and met my family, I educated her, and she learned a lot more about us, and came to understand that, yeah, the reason that a lot of us mixed race Aboriginal people are troublesome people is because we're troubled people. You know, you've got to walk in 2 worlds. So, and we understand a lot of the injustice. You know, the old people suffered it, but they didn't have the voice. They didn't know how to say that, you know, this is wrong, and write letters to governments and things like that, and get up in court and object to it. But, you know, us younger people, I've been educated in 2 ways. You know, I was educated in the normal education system, and my grandmother was actually an ex-teacher, so I learnt quite a bit in that world. And then I was taught by some of the best, some of our men of high degree in our Aboriginal ways. So I've got what I like to call a dual education. And, you know, I can fight in places that our old people never would have even thought of. I've realised just recently some of the sort of ways that I viewed things in the past. I still had that hangover of growing up as a white child, you know, in a white society. And, you know, some of the things that the old people taught me years ago are only just making sense to me now, as I decolonise my mind. You know, my sisters and my little brother both, you know, the 3 of them all work. You know, they're well-respected people in the community. But given my adventurous nature and that, and the way that Mum was, you know, she was doing it pretty rough around the time that I would have been a young fella with her. And you know, I probably would have run into a lot of trouble, and who knows, I might end up being one of the Aboriginal deaths in custody or something like that. You know, who knows? So I looked as a gift actually that I grew up with my grandmother, because I got the education I did, you know, and I learnt some things that I wouldn't have learned if I had grown up with mum. You know, I can never replace that time. You know, it's like, yeah, okay, we can't go back into the past and redo it again. You know, I didn't get to bond with my mother like my sisters and brother did, and I've noticed the difference, you know, in the way that she treats me as to them over the years. You know, I always like to try new things and take a lot of risk, I suppose, and yeah, who knows where that might have led me if I was, you know, living in a sort of very mixed up Aboriginal community at that time. You know, people were living in the city. Then our mobs just sort of moved into the cities, really, and they were trying to find a place in the cities. You know, and a lot of the people didn't want them there. And a lot of the time, the only people that talked to Aboriginal people in the cities were, you know, what was deemed the lower classes and that. So, you know, a lot of people my age actually are dead now. I'm what you'd call an endangered species, being an Aboriginal male that was removed from his family and he's over 50. You know, most of my peer group are dead. Yeah, I wanted to know what, you know, sort of where my place was in the world. And I knew that what I was being told as a kid sort of didn't fit right. I've got a 14-year-old son, a 12-year-old daughter, an 11-year-old daughter, a 7-year-old daughter, and a 5-year-old stepson. And we've been battling the Child Protection Department in Victoria for the last 5 years. My kids have been in and out of there. They've used the domestic violence regime now, the way it's gone crazy. There's definitely some bad men in this world that harm women and children. But it seems that any of us that run foul of the police are now tagged or tarred with the same brush as those sort of men. And Child Protection are using the domestic violence laws to split families up. You know, you see a collusion happen between the local Child Protection Office, the domestic violence police, the local magistrates that they see every day. Right? And if you don't get a chance to fight things properly, once they take your kids using the legislation, you know, and they go to the court for an interim accommodation order, and then they try and turn it into a family preservation order if you're lucky, or a family restoration order. Well, you don't get a chance to challenge that, what they're doing in the first place, unless you can mount a Supreme Court challenge, you know, and most of us can't afford a lawyer that would be able to do that. And those of us that have got the skills to do it ourselves, you can't, you know, it's an enormous effort to be able to do that, you know. So once they enter into your life, and they can enter into your life on rumour and innuendo and lies, right, and there's no burden of proof on them then. Unlike the rest of the justice system, the criminal justice system, where there's a requirement for a certain level of burden of proof to fall on the police and the prosecutors, once Child Protection have your kids, you got virtually no hope. And I feel for most people who don't have at least a basic understanding of the law and their rights within the law, because they're going to get done over in the system, and their kids are going to suffer for it. You know, I've had to battle the department in the last 2 months. I've spent 4 days in court. I fought for 2 days to get my 14-year-old son back in July. I won him, and then they took my daughters at the time to won my son back. And last week I fought for 2 days in the court again, and I won my daughters back. So now I've got 4 children. And I'm fighting to get their brother, who I don't call him a step or anything, he's part of our family. You know, I may not be his biological father, but I'm the only dad he's ever known in his life. And he calls me dad, and he needs to be with his family. The poor little fella's been in out-of-home care for 12 months. He's with a non-Aboriginal family. He sees his family, luckily, because we don't live in Swan Hill, you know, and he lives over that way. So he gets to see him once every 5 or 6 weeks for an hour if he's lucky. You know, and we feel that he's being targeted because he's got fair skin. All my other children are dark skinned. You know, their mum's fairly dark. So he gets treated differently because of the colour of his skin. How come, you know, I can have my 4 children, it's been a hard-won fight to get them back, but they still don't want to hand this little fella over to us. And the only thing that we can put it down to is that he's got fair skin. They work in collusion with the domestic violence police, and I've got a long record with police for what they call the street crime offences. A lot of drunken, disorderly and low-level assaults and assault police. And, you know, I've had a magistrate himself describe it to me as street crime, you know, and he said it's a symptom of being a member of the stolen generation. I didn't even work it out till he said it to me that that's probably what was going on. But they use that long history, criminal history, they say, you know, and there's been allegations of domestic violence on me that have been, the person who did that has refuted those in the end. Some people use that system to, you know, meet the needs that they want at that time. And I've been to court over things and I've beaten it. And the magistrate in Melbourne, when I got my girls back, questioned the department on their using this. It's their go-to tool to split children up from their families. And the magistrate questioned them on, okay, where's your proof of this? You keep saying this, but I don't see any proof. I see Mr. Perry has provided plenty of proof on everything he says, but the department doesn't normally have to provide proof. And when that was actually put on them to do so, they couldn't because they didn't have any. We're not together, me and their mum, but I support her to be the best mum she could be. Like, I'd prefer her to be looking after the girls. You know, I'm their dad, and I play a certain role. But because of the department, the way they've treated us, I've had to play mum as well. But I support their mum to be the best mum she can be. But the department hasn't lived up to their side of the bargain because they're supposed to support her to get her on her feet. You know, because she's sort of a product of the stolen generation too. Because her mother was sort of removed when she was young, and her father was grew up on a mission in South Australia. And yeah, a lot of her family has been removed over the years, kids out of her family, not from her direct family. Her dad fought very hard to keep all the kids. But her mum's family, there's been lots of their kids taken over the years. So Yvonne's a product of that stolen generation too, the kid's mum. Right? So the department should take that into account because this is the intergenerational trauma. You know, and instead of looking at that and saying, oh, what's the best way we can support you? They've got a checklist of things. Oh, yep, we reckon that's the problem, we reckon that's the problem, we reckon that's the problem. And they come in and they dictate to you, well, this is what you're going to do. All right. And it's not one size fits all. We're all different. You know, we're human beings. And our families have different requirements. But they treat us all the same. It's like they tar us all with one brush. Okay, oh, you're Aboriginal, so domestic violence is going to be the problem and drugs and alcohol are going to be the problem. Well, I'm sorry, if they took the time out to have a look, okay, some of those things might impact some of our families, but look at the circumstances. Those are symptoms of something else wrong. These are symptoms of poverty and a class inequality. So it's got to be incremental changes. And the first thing that I do is have an independent umpire here. You know, when there's allegations of child abuse and that, you know, they need to have somebody that can stand apart from this and run their eye over it and make sure the department is doing the right things that they need to do, that they're following the legislation, right, and that they actually apply some burden of proof to these things. Right, because it's no good going in and destroying families and traumatising children, because that's what they do, right, on unfounded allegations, right, because they create lifelong trauma. Like every time I've managed to fight them and win my kids back off them, it takes me months to get them back into a stable state, and they're going to suffer from this for the rest of their life. Once you've had it done to you, you don't ever get rid of it. It's still that assimilationist policy at work. And their belief of what an Aboriginal person is somebody who lives in the suburbs, on the fringe, and they drink and they smoke and all of this sort of stuff, and they don't work. That's how the department views us. They don't know real grassroots Aboriginal people. They know nothing about our culture and tradition. Like they don't even get forced to do cultural awareness training, right? Let alone actually do some research and learn what Aboriginal people are really like, and what our culture and traditions are. Because I see my problem with the department as being a war of ideologies. Like I said, I've learnt my law and tradition over the last 31 years. I'm grounded in it. I live it, and some of our old ways aren't fit for purpose in the modern world. I understand that, but it was a good culture and tradition that helped us survive for a very, very long time in this country. So it can't have all been wrong. And I see the department trying to turn us into some ideal that they've got now. And I'm not just talking about us Aboriginal people. Any of the kids that they get hold of, they've got this perfect sort of idea in their head of what a family should be. And, I wonder if their families would come up to scratch to that. I don't know. I had one of our caseworkers say to me, when I started saying, look, I think your department's being racist towards us. Their reply to me was, oh, Darren, no, don't be like that. My mum found out that we're Aboriginal somewhere back. And I'm going, are you kidding me? I said, okay, well, you don't know what it's like to have a death in custody in your family. You don't know what it's like to have one of your children stolen. All of the problems, you don't live in poverty like us. I said, until you've experienced those things, don't try and tell me that you're Aboriginal just because you've got some genealogy back in your line somewhere. It's a lived experience to be Aboriginal. And as I said to you earlier, Tony, like, my focus isn't just Aboriginal children alone, it's all kids, because all kids have got a right to grow up happy, healthy, and with a good outlook on the future. They've got to have dreams. Kids without dreams are, they're sad kids.
Yeah.
And that's what we've got to see. And there's an opportunity to share the beautiful parts of our culture with everybody in Australia, and that's what I want to do. And if kids these days, non-Aboriginal kids, can share in the good stuff that our kids have got, and grow up with them, because some of my kids' friends, like, they got some Aboriginal friends and they got non-Aboriginal friends, and they learn a lot off my kids, because my kids are being brought up in their culture from day one. So they share that all the time, and they recognise for it around town at the school. Like my daughter Christina, 12 years old, she's the first ever Aboriginal part of the leadership group there, because they don't have school captains at her school, they got a leadership group. And she's the first ever Aboriginal leader in the school. So, a lot of people value the traditional teachings, the cultural teachings that my kids have had from me and our extended family. So, I'd love to be able to offer that to all kids.